name's Grogan. We're here with Darin Henry of Situation Comics or Sitcoms?
Sitcomics, yeah.
What kind of issues do you have right now?
The Blue Baron, it's a 64-page superhero story about a superhero who switches bodies with a teenager. And it's in that Freaky Friday vein, and it just seemed like a good way to introduce a whole new universe of superhero characters. And it brings about, it plays with what I've done in comedy, which is get a funny premise and see it realized. And the artists I've hired, Ron Friends and Sal Buscema, have helped me do that in a wonderful way. So I'm looking forward to the reaction. I've been getting a great reaction so far, and I'm looking forward to even more people checking them out and telling me what they think.
Okay, so we're here in the future. What brought you in the past, your comedy, people that influenced you in the past to get to this?
Yeah, well, as I was growing up, I gravitated toward Britcoms, which weren't as easy to find back in the 80s, but the local TV station, WITF, was programmed by a man named Tom Keck. And Tom put a lot of these wonderful sitcoms on that were totally different from what I was seeing in American comedy. And my love for that stuff just sort of drew me to WITF, and I ended up becoming a volunteer, then a telemarketer, and just grew into becoming part of that channel until I was working in the programming department at WITF. I went to London again because of my love for Britcoms, and I met all these wonderful comedy writers like the guys who did Red Dwarf and Blackadder and the Young Ones. And I wrote a paper about how the alternative comics were becoming part of the establishment through their sitcoms, like Young Ones, the ones I just said. And I went back to the station and I worked there, and I said, well, I'm jumping, sorry, let me go back, because during my senior year of college, I discovered Seinfeld. And Seinfeld was a show that seemed to have all the hallmarks of the Britcoms, but it was totally American, and they made 22 episodes a season. And the reason I think that I was drawn to it is because Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld were so consistently the voices of that show. And in most American sitcoms, it's a team-written atmosphere, and the comedy sort of comes from the people in the room working together to make the jokes funnier, as opposed to a very specific voice coming from the center of that show. And when I started watching Seinfeld, I just knew, okay, they don't just do what I love in Britain, they do it here too, and I was drawn to it so much I wrote 4 Seinfeld specs. And that brings me back to when I was about to finish college. I went back to this WITF station, and I mentioned to the folks there that I was so invested in what I was interested in writing. I was going to move to Los Angeles, and it turned out that one of the guys I was talking to, Mike Greenwald, who was a big development guy there, and it turned out he knew the director of Seinfeld. So this whole 4-year process, and that's why I rambled a bit, because it was a lot of steps along the way, but at a certain point, all my interests sort of came together in that conversation, and it turned out that he was willing to get me a conversation with the director of Seinfeld, and I had all these scripts. It was just a perfect kismet. I just loved that moment in my life. I'll never forget it.
So the Van Buren episode, which is a great episode,
yeah.
What was your inspiration for that?
Well, the part that I really worked the most on was where where George gives a kid he thinks is just like he was a break, and the kid screws him over just like he would have done if he had that situation. And that was just, you just go into the Seinfeld offices. By that point, Larry had moved on, and it was just a matter of going in and pitching to Jerry and the other writers and finding the stories that they were as interested in as they could be, because at a certain point, I was writing for the Muppets at that time, and it really required their full attention, and I couldn't give it my full attention. But once I wrote my draft, the team came in and we worked on it together and rewrote it, and then it got made. So
I have to ask you another one. The Slicer episode.
The Slicer.
What was the inspiration for that?
I can tell you that.
Yeah, your own Slicer.
I mean, no, it was less the Slicer part, because we shared story credit, and my part was the Elaine story, in which she has a neighbor leave town, but the alarm is still on. So she can't get access to this alarm, and it's keeping her up all night. And what I felt was, what inspired that was because I had a roommate at the time who was also writing for Seinfeld, and I would come back, because I was freelancing, I would come back to Pennsylvania, and I'd be on the plane going, oh my gosh, I left my alarm on. And that neuroses and all those sort of paranoid neuroses are just the healthiest thing in comedy. They're so unhealthy in real life, but when you're really trying to figure out what a relatable moment is and how to connect with other people in comedy, any kind of emotion where you're upset or you're scared or you're nervous. Those are the things that, if you were feeling that, chances are a lot of other people do too, and that's how you build it. And then I pitched a story that got into Curb Your Enthusiasm. It's about a tourist that approaches Larry and says, "Can you take our picture?" And they get into an argument about how to hold the camera. Mm-hmm. Again, it's just coming out of those moments where you feel like you're talking to a stranger and it's awkward, and any awkwardness, it just is Larry, when I heard the pitch, he just laughed, and I knew it was like, okay, well, there's one. Yeah.
Now, you said you did the Muppets. I see that you also wrote Casey Undercover, and that's the girl from
what
Shake
I'm
It
doing
Up.
now. Yep.
My girls watch it. We love it.
Great, thanks.
How do you come up with stuff that you have kid stuff and then you have adult stuff? So
it's all comes from just that feeling that when I'm in the writer's room, you just have to imagine what would make me laugh if I were watching this show, and you just use your imagination, and it all comes from the same place as far as I'm concerned. I did a show called Grosse Pointe, which was on the WB, which was one of my favorite jobs, with Darin Starr, who obviously has more experience in 1-hour shows, but this was a parody or a satire of the making of a 1-hour show, but a comedy. And I started that job. I was a little anxious because I wasn't sure I was really ready for satirical humor, but it was one of those things where once I got my comfort level, I was pitching stories and they were getting in, and it was just, I'm much more comfortable when it comes to getting stories pitched. That's really where I feel my strongest, and that's a big cause of that was the Seinfeld experience, where the story is everything. It's not about the jokes. It's not about whose zinger is better, and it's about finding that really inherently funny story and relatable story, and then using the wonderful Seinfeld characters to make it funny. And you'd read a Seinfeld script. When I was in college reading Seinfeld scripts, it was like, wait, there's no jokes here. It's all just the situation. And that was what drew me to that show, I think, as well.
Interesting. So now, because of not only the writing skills, but bringing those different skills to the comics, you have a number of different ones, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's another great thing about comics. I'm telling stories about vampires and superheroes, and I knew that that's not what network television is in the market for at the moment, but I really want to tell those stories. And if you want to tell them and you're not an artist and you don't write prose, I can't write any prose, I just don't know how to even start. Collaborating with artists is such a wonderful way to get these stories out, and I'm really pleased and happy with them. Yeah,
Ron and Sal?
I've read Ron and Sal's work my whole life, and I'm excited about the fact that they were willing to take part in this totally new company. And Jeff Schultz, who's I would look through all the Archie books because I figured that was a good way to do this. I wanted something relatable with a whole new universe. And Jeff's art was just my favorite of all what I was seeing coming out of Archie at that time, and it was an easy thing to, look him up, and I got in touch, and we started working together. And 2 years later, I'm holding the product of this book.
Excuse me. So you have some heavy hitters on this book. So how can you afford them? I thought I read somewhere that you were selling some of your old comics.
I'm in the process of selling my entire Silver and Bronze Age Marvel collection to pay for these. I've loved them, but at a certain point it was necessary to just realize I wanted to take this risk, and I didn't want to use all of our savings. So I realized that the natural thing would be to sell my beloved comics to make some new beloved comics, and that's what I did.
It almost sounds like something Kevin Smith did, and he found the steps to success.
Yeah.
So where can we get these comics now, currently, website?
The central Pennsylvania area is the only place selling the print copies this summer.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten some retailers that I might ship to, but really I'm most focused on making this I'm testing the market basically for my books, and that means, if a corporation tried a new product, they would never spring it on the whole country all at once. They would test it, as they often do. Right. And the national distribution of comics requires even the smallest publisher to take this gigantic plunge into a market that's completely, you can see, it's filled with books. Yep. So I felt like that was, something I couldn't invest that kind of money into that national exposure. So I came back here where I grew up. I felt like this was a good market to test a new product, and that's what I'm doing. And so the print copies are exclusively available here. There is a digital, it's available to download on my website, sitcomics.net, and it's also available, both books are available on comicsology.com.
So picking the vampire book, what was
Yeah.
your inspiration? How did you come up with this idea?
I just, ideas are funny things because they are a combination of just random inspiration and also just the determination to, create. And this one, I think, was more random inspiration. I got this idea about two women from completely different backgrounds who ended up being two-timed by a vampire, and they discover that they've been two-timed, and then they discover he's a vampire by the fact that he's turned them into vampires too. So it just was a premise. I felt like I got who I wanted to cast in my imagination, and it was just a case of finding out what happens, and I was finding it out as I was writing it and making that.
How about the Blue Baron? What was the inspiration
The
for
Blue
this
Baron.
one?
The Blue Baron was something I thought of about 15 years ago when I was first thinking of. I had this idea for a comic book, and it was like a body swap story, but it wasn't. It was dark. It was like a gritty thing, in which a person who had a lot of secrets switched bodies with someone who was young and naive. So a kid realizing some dark stuff is going on, and that somebody who wasn't what they seemed on the outside by being inside them. And I set that aside, and then when I first thought of coming up with Sitcomics, I wanted to work with folks like Sal Buscema and Ron Friend. So I thought this idea is actually the right one. It's just I wanted to make the execution lighter and fun. And it felt like a perfect type of sitcomic to make the body swap thing happen in a world where the kid is switching bodies with a character who has not updated his look for 200 years. And it's like he's the corny character, according to the kids that follow superheroes in that universe. And so he actually ends up getting powers, but he doesn't want to be that particular powerful character. So it just felt like putting all that experience and history into what I'm doing with the Sitcomics. It felt like the way to approach the story this time.
It's a nice refreshing thing. It's not somebody not wearing capes. It's a new storyline. I mean, anybody can sell Batman and Spider-Man, but this sounds interesting. So it's not like something that's cliche and been done before. It's a nice refreshing.
It's definitely. I'm very excited to create new things. My frustration sometimes as a comic book fan is with the fact that there just doesn't seem to be anything new being generated from the major companies. I think it's because of legal reasons and no one's willing to give up their original creations. But I find that to be, as a reader, kind of frustrating because a reboot and a revamp and a renaming, it's all very much a case of recycling what's already been done. And I remember as a kid, a new character would be injected into that universe, and it would just change the dynamic somehow, even ever so slightly. That I missed that in comics and the superhero comics, and I'm making a new universe. I mean, there's 7 more titles on their way, and 5 of them are part of the same universe as Blue Baron, and it's been fun to create worlds, to create a whole new superhero universe, and still every story, I'm not revealing some of the things that make them Sitcomics, but every story has a very specific hook that makes it part of the same brand, and I'm really excited to get those stories out there.
So you have 7 more titles coming down?
Yeah.
When do you anticipate them coming out?
Well, they're all works in progress. Some of them are almost 2/3 of the way done. Some of them are 1/3 of the way done. It's just a case of, balancing what I'm doing as a sitcom writer and the time I have to commit to making the comics, and also waiting for artists to have their schedules available to finish what they've already started. So it's a process of I wish I could make the books the way I would like to release them, a quarterly thing, because they're 3 times the content, 64 pages.
Whoa.
For just a little under $6. So I mean, it's 3 times the content for less than twice the price, and that's a big package. And the idea is to make a book that feels like a trade when you're reading it, but you look at it and it looks like a comic book.
Yeah. Mm.
So there's an arc in every issue, is what I feel, and it's definitely takes a while. It's time consuming, and if I were able to, pull everybody together and work together at the best and most efficient way, it would be a quarterly title. All of them.
Technically, a quarterly with as many pages, you already put out 3 books.
Exactly,
In that sense.
exactly.
So the
So-
fan base are getting a lot of book
Yeah,
bang for their buck.
I really believe that what I'm trying to do is to get a book that, or a brand, or when you see a sitcomic, when you buy it, you're going to get the whole thing, the whole story. We're in a binge watching entertainment media era, and yet comics are clinging to this, serialized arcs, and you require people who aren't comic book fans. The idea that a person who's not a comic book fan would find a comic book store 6 times in 6 months and try to track down a story, and that's
Right.
only if it's not sold out when they get to the store.
Right.
I just find that to be self-defeating in a way, because if a movie company released a movie, it was a 2-hour movie and 20 minutes per month for $4, I don't think the public would ever go to the movies.
You're
And I just feel like one of the reasons that maybe comics have less mainstream appeal, despite the fact that the characters are mainstream, is because the format isn't quite made for new readers. And so that's what I'm hoping to do with these sitcomics.
It sounds like a great formula to get into
Yeah.
people's hands. Well, I thank you for this interview.
pleasure.
Remember, check out his website and the books. And anything else you want to say?
No, I'm really excited. I feel like the books have gotten a great response, and I'm hoping for more folks out there who are interested and give my books a chance, because I think they'll really enjoy them.
I certainly will before the day's out.
All right, thanks,
Thank you so
Liam.
much, sir.